Welcome to the Shared Practices Podcast, Season 2, Episode 5. We are on acquisitions. This season, we're trying to acquire a practice and then run it like a business owner with systems. So today we have Matt Porter. And I love having this podcast because I actually have a few upcoming guests that I've known before they were dental experts, and now I know them after they've got all this additional experience. And the nice part about that is that I inherently trust these people. Like, I know them personally, and I would hire them, and they are also very competent. So Kira Dent is another one that we're going to have a little bit later in the season. So this episode, we look at this idea of the baby steps and specifics of what you should do to acquire a practice. So he goes through who you should contact first, where you should look at practices, his take on this, where you're looking, rural versus urban. And we get into the topic of goodwill, meaning the value of the practice that you're purchasing that's not the equipment and the supplies and the furniture, but the value of those charts and those relationships and those patients. And what are the implications of that in terms of negotiations, how to negotiate, how to see the perspective of both the buyer and the seller, and how that has tax implications. I learned a ton in this episode, and this is the stuff that I've been looking forward to in this season that I feel like I haven't heard elsewhere, and it's going to get meaty, both in this episode and some of the future episodes. We're going to go pretty deep on some of the financials, so enjoy this episode. And also, you're going to notice that there's only a spear ad in this episode. I'm going to release a bonus episode as a thank you to Blue Sky Bio. I have backed myself into a little bit of a corner with my daytime job and relationship with the Army and the sponsorship with Blue Sky Bio. And I'm going to get into that in this bonus episode that I'm going to release. But in order to just avoid any sort of gray area, we're going to switch out the sponsorship. So what this means is that I'm using Blue Sky Plan and Blue Sky Bio's workflow during the day, which I thought this was going to be something that I would never get to do until I was out of the Army and had moved on and bought on all my own stuff. And I'm also training other people how to do that as well. I don't want there to be any construal of the relationship between me talking about this on the podcast and what I'm doing during the day. And it's definitely a gray area, and I could justify my position and keep having them on the show since this is my wife's podcast and I'm just helping her out. But I want to be clear of that. So I'll go into that a little bit more. And we've got an interview with Dr. Corey Glenn, the whole episode, the whole interview that I recorded with him that has some really actually good business stuff from a guy who is way more passionate about clinical stuff than he is the business of dentistry. So we'll get that out to you sometime in the next week, between now and next Friday and our next regular episode. In the meantime, enjoy this interview with Matt Porter. I've got with us today Matt Porter, and Matt and I are friends. We kind of go back probably about 5 years now that we've known each other, and you've had an interesting journey into the world of dentistry. So welcome on the podcast, and do you mind sharing your story and what you're doing now?
You bet. Now, I can give you the short version or the long version. There is no short version.
Sure.
Because people ask me, what do I do for work? And I tell them, hey, I'm a dental transitions broker. I help broker and consult the purchase and sale of dental practices. And everyone just kind of gives me this stupefied look. A lot of people say, I didn't even know that's a thing.
Well, it's not really. I mean, how many are there of you? Like probably 100 in the, I don't know, maybe 200 in the country? At the most.
And the majority of that number are part-timers where they're slashies, right?
Right.
They're broker / consultant or broker / attorney or broker / CPA.
Or dentist. I saw a guy on Facebook who he's a dentist and he's a broker on the side.
Yeah. So my wife can't even articulate what I do for work. And I tease, I say, well, I knew from a young age growing up that I wanted to help successfully transition dental practice.
When you were like
right?
7 playing in the sand,
Right.
that's what you wanted.
So the process for me to get to this point, actually, my undergraduate degree was in construction management. I loved home building and real estate development. I worked a lot for Habitat for Humanity in high school, and that's kind of where I wanted to blend the construction hands-on aspect,
Nice.
and the technical side with business. So I got a dual degree in business and construction management. And then I moved down to Arizona. At the time, the real estate market was just exploding.
Sure.
I started working for a startup home builder. Then I went and got an executive MBA nights and weekends while I was still working full time as a home builder. And then I moved over to a large national home builder right before the market dipped. And that was a real fortunate move. They were privately held. They are a third generation company with a very long-term perspective. So they kept me on and grew me within the company to the point where when you and I knew each other and we were neighbors, you were going to dental school, I was the director of operations for their market here in town. I was responsible for buying land, doing the acquisition, the improvements, the entitlements, putting in roads and infrastructures, doing the civil engineering, and then managing all the vertical construction of the homes as well.
So am I allowed to say the name of that company?
No, that's fine. It's Shea Homes. Shea Homes is pretty well known in certain submarkets.
Yeah.
Good company, good family owned, been around for over 125 years. They treated me great.
What got you into this weird little sub niche of a market?
So at that point, I was managing their business operation unit here in town, profit and loss of about $50 million a year in revenue.
Okay.
And a couple hundred employees, not all direct reports, but responsible for a couple hundred employees and subcontractors. And it was stressful. I have no problem managing the strategy and the financial side of things, but anytime you have that critical mass of so many employees that you're ultimately responsible for, I felt like on any given day, there was a fire to put out and drama to deal with. And at the same time, I had a good group of core friends from grad school, from the MBA program. One of those individuals was a commercial real estate broker here in town, started his own brokerage, and about 10 years ago, accidentally fell into the niche of becoming specialized in dental commercial real estate. I don't know, nationwide, most of the markets don't have enough critical mass for you to specialize in that narrow of a niche. But here in Arizona, certainly there's...
How many practices? Like 1,200 or something around there in the Phoenix Valley?
At least. Last time I looked, there were over 3,000 licensed, active dental license in Maricopa County, which is the county that comprises most of Phoenix. Now, some of those guys and gals are in their 70s and they're retired, but they keep their license active and they like to go to the conventions and do CE. But that 3,000 is a big number.
Sure.
So my partner, Tanner Milne, founded the real estate side of doing dental transactions, helping dentists do startups, identify good locations for a scratch start, walk them through the process that entails, helping them buy their building, sell their building at retirement, renewing leases with a landlord.
So I first heard about Menlo before you were working with them. You know, you were friends with them, obviously, but there was a dentist at my dental school who she had bought this like Taj Mahal of a practice right around 2006 in North Phoenix. Like, what's above Scottsdale?
Maybe Cave Creek, Fountain Hills.
I think somewhere around there. And it was this huge multi-unit commercial building that had like 60 commercial spaces in it. And she like built out this amazing, beautiful practice. And of course, overpaid for it, overbuilt. And then the market collapsed and she was stuck with like this payment it was like 20 grand or something crazy. Oh yeah. And then no one else rented out that commercial unit. So it was like this ghost town of like her and a couple other tenants in this like 60 unit, beautiful new commercial space that was just this Arizona ghost town. A few years later, when her lease was coming close to being due, or maybe even before, he negotiated for her to buy a space in that same complex that was smaller and wrap up the old lease. She was able to like own her space, and her costs were like a fifth of what they were before. Like it was this just crazy, because then the market was at the bottom, and so she scooped up an amazing deal. So anyways, I had heard about Menlo and like how they could help people out before I even really had talked to you about them.
Right. And that's really where the brand and reputation started from here in the Valley, was doing just that. Especially during the downturn, dentists were the most credit-worthy tenants in a lot of these either shopping centers or inline retail medical office complex.
Right.
So Tanner would go back, even if they had signed a long-term lease at a high market rate at the time. Tanner was very successful and rich, going back and renegotiating with the landlord back down to peg the lease at current market rents.
Right.
Helping the landlord understand that they'd be able to secure that stable, credit-worthy tenant through the downturn, when a lot of other tenants were leaving and vacating and defaulting on their leases.
Sure.
So that was where they really gained a lot of market share with helping dentists here in town. So they've been doing that. There's two of those guys full-time doing that. They'll do anywhere between 80 to 100 transactions a year.
That's crazy.
Here in Arizona. Yeah. Then about 3 years ago, they reached out to me. We've always stayed in touch, stayed close, gone out to breakfast about once a quarter, twice a year, just as informal business advisors to each other. So they sat down and said, "Hey, Matt, we got a great business idea. We want you to come with us and start helping broker and transition dental practice sales." And what do you think my response was?
No thanks. I got a good job.
Yeah, I laughed at him. I said, "Guys, that's not a thing. That doesn't even sound real. And furthermore, it's a niche of a niche of a niche of a niche.
Right. It's
business brokerage, but just medical, but just dental, but just in Arizona. That can't be substantial enough for me to leave what's a great career and a great company." And
how many kids did you have at the time?
3, with a 4th on the way. Right. It was not like I was at a point in my career where I could make a big jump into a different industry and take a risk on something that was kind of an unproven commodity for me.
But you did.
I did. And that's a long story of the decision-making process but I made the jump. So fast forward, that was about 3 years ago. So I just kind of parachuted in the dental industry, had what I'd consider a pretty solid background in terms of business acumen, understanding financial reports, having run a business unit myself, and have an MBA, understanding the inner workings of a business when it comes to evaluation and appraisal standpoint, and so having the relationship and reputation to kind of springboard into the dental market already built by Rich and Tanner. There was a lot of natural synergy there.
Okay.
And last year we closed the year, just myself and an assistant, doing completing 30 transitions here in town.
That's amazing. That's a ton of work, and wow. Okay. So you've had some rapid growth in a very short period of time.
Yep. Yeah.
And obviously it's working out for people because they keep sending people your way. And actually James Heaton, who was on the season 1 of the podcast, failed to give you a shout out for doing a couple transactions with him. So we're going to have to give him a hard time.
Yeah, I busted his chops. I sold him 2 practices and he can't even give me a plug on the podcast.
Oh, that's what friends are for. So I would love to get your perspective on the acquisition process, because that's what we're doing in season 2. And we're going to take the assumption that we've got a 1 to 2, maybe 3 year out new grad who has, some significant student loans, but also has some cash set aside, some liquid cash, and they're looking to buy. And I want to walk them through this process, because I feel like there's no here's the cookbook, here's step A, here's step B, here's step C. And the first part of that is I feel like people start in one of 2 places. They either start just looking at random practices, or they start reaching out to people to help them with this process. So let's start with the people side of things. Who should or could be involved with this transaction, and at what point do you need to involve them?
You want to involve most of them on the early side. As soon as you've made an internal commitment to find a practice of your own.
And when you say them, let's list it out. Who all would be like the core players of this transaction?
Your dream team that you're going to build is a broker,
okay,
an attorney, a CPA,
okay,
potentially a real estate broker,
okay,
and some type of consultant or practice advisor.
Okay. And then usually one of those will also end up having a lender that they work with.
Yes, that's a good point. Yes.
And sometimes you can get a local bank, and you can find your own lender. And sometimes that actually can be better. I've heard some pretty good financing by local banks, but that could be maybe its own little category as well.
I'd almost add that to the top tier team. I think that's a good point.
Okay. So
the challenge, the reason why I didn't mention that is because a lot of these lenders that have a dental specialty product have a certain niche or a credit box that they like to service. Some banks like small practices. Some banks like really good cash flow. Some banks will only do practices over $1 million. Some banks will only do multi-practice. So the lender will depend, even the specialty guys and gals will depend on once you've at least somewhat narrowed down your search criteria.
Okay, so maybe the lender isn't the first step, but maybe you want to contact those first people that we talked about at the beginning, even if you're not like actively using them at the moment, but you're going to be using them once the transition happens. How would you do that? Like for you, how soon does someone contact you if they want you to represent them as like a buyer's broker?
Yeah, that's a great question. The market for a buyer's broker is very small and limited. There aren't a whole lot of buyer brokers in the market as I've experienced it. Most of the time, there are brokers that do a dual representation approach.
Okay.
And then there are seller's brokers. So full disclosure, I'm a seller. I operate typically as a seller's broker.
Okay.
I probably, I transitioned 30 practices this year. And in addition to that, I had about 5 to 7 where I had a buyer approach me and say, hey, I found a practice for sale by another broker or for sale by owner. I'd like you to look at things for me, do an appraisal, just validate that I'm making a good decision. But by and large, as a buyer, the brokers are being paid by the seller, and their fiduciary responsibility, their obligation is to the seller.
Okay.
And you always want to keep that in mind. Most of the brokers will have good intentions, but just remember that at the end of the day, they don't represent you.
Well, I like to relate this to real estate because that's something that most people understand, at least, that when someone goes to sell their home, they typically list it with a realtor. A lot of times a buyer will often find a realtor, and you can do dual representation when you're buying a house. You can have a realtor that represents both sides, but it can get sticky. I got my realtor's license in dental school in Arizona because I'm crazy. And it's something that, like, as a realtor, it's like, oh yeah, I get commissions on both sides. It's like, it's, and then you can like give someone a deal, or, like, oh, well, I don't have to charge you the full 3%. I can charge you 1.5 because I'm getting 3% over here. It just feels a little sticky because now there's a transfer of information. You're in the middle, and like, maybe something about this property that you should tell the buyer because you're representing them, but if you're representing the seller, like, you have to be honest and everything, but some people might not be honest because there's incentives for them to get the deal done so they get paid.
That's right. And a lot of the dual representation groups will actually collect a commission or a fee from the seller and another one from the buyer. And I've always thought that odd if both parties are actually paying the broker. The other challenge that I see is, unlike a piece of real estate, when you're transitioning a practice, there the complexity is so great.
Sure.
And there's so many moving pieces and parts. And there are certain times when there are deal points that are inevitably pitted against each other. The most common one being asset allocation for tax purposes.
Okay.
You set a purchase price, and then you have to determine how much of that is goodwill, how much of it is equipment, how much are supplies, how much of it's furniture. And the tax treatment for what's good for the buyer is bad for the seller, and what's good for the seller is bad for the buyer in terms of the way they can write it off and depreciate it from taxes. So you're diametrically opposed on that point. And those are the kind of things where I see, even if somebody's good, honest, and ethical, you reach a couple of those deal points during the process of a transition where even a good ethical broker can't fully represent the best interests of both parties.
Okay. So it can get sticky, and not that it's always bad to use one of these either transition companies or brokers that's representing both sides. If they're good people and they're making the deal happen, it can work out in everyone's favor to get the deal done. However, just know that I don't know. I just don't even know what to tell people, because a lot of times it works. They use a transition company that makes it all happen, and they do it full service. And it's like, if you have a good practice and that's what you need to get done to get the practice, that's what you do.
That's right. I think the only thing to say is just go into it eyes wide open.
Right.
You don't need to distrust, and it works successfully in plenty of circumstances. Just go into it knowing that the broker's representation, whether they're just representing the seller or trying to represent both parties. So that being said, the way I'd suggest with most brokers, and I think most of them are seller representatives. If I were 1, 2, 3 years out of school and I felt like I was ready to go find a practice to purchase, the first thing I would do is go find a lender to talk to. We talked about putting that maybe in the secondary category, but you at least want to have a preliminary conversation with a lender and know what your general criteria can be, what you can qualify for.
If they're afraid of you because you have awful credit and you couldn't produce and you don't have the right documentation and anything, then you're going to waste a lot of people's time when the deal's just not going to happen because you can't get lending.
That's right. Now, it's not like buying a house.
You don't get pre-qualified with a little form.
Yes. And they'll say, hey, Richard, congratulations. You're pre-qualified to buy a home up to $550,000.
Sure.
Because the real estate piece is a fixed value. The approval process of a lender when you're buying a practice is much more dynamic. They overlay you and your personal financial statement, what your student loan payments are, what your rent or mortgage obligations are, what your auto payment is, everything else that you have. They'll lay that on top of the cash flow that the practice produces. And so it's kind of a dynamic thing. And probably the most interesting that I've come across is this is counterintuitive. Banks are more comfortable lending a larger dollar amount than a smaller dollar amount. Have you ever heard that before?
It's a consistent theme that I have both heard before I started my podcast and since I've done it. And it is counterintuitive to like what every young dentist wants. It's like, well, I'll just buy a small practice and grow it because I don't want to take out more loans. Like that's everyone's thought. And you think that you're on HGTV and that you can flip it. You're like, oh, I'll just come in and I'll take this $300,000 practice and take it to $900,000. But it doesn't seem like, speaking to experts like you and others, everyone consistently has said, don't buy too small, buy bigger, buy what you can handle, but don't hamstring yourself by getting this mini practice to start off with.
That's right, because a bigger practice provides bigger cash flow for you to service all those debts that you just came out of dental school with. And remember, you used to be a Dave Ramsey disciple, correct?
Mm-hmm. I've since lost the faith, but yeah.
Okay. I remember you going through that phase, and it's kind of counter to what Dave Ramsey suggests. You don't want to take on consumer debt. getting a new car, getting a bigger home, things like that.
Sure.
But what you're really doing here is borrowing money to purchase a job and purchase cash flow. So it's a completely different type of debt than consumer debt. I had a transition that just closed recently. This is the very ideal transition. Retiring dentist. He's about 70, and he's getting ready to leave the practice. He was doing $1 million to 1.1 a year every year for the last 4 years, like clockwork. He leaves. Guy comes in and buys the practice. He's about 5 years out of school, has the clinical chops, has produced, has his hands speed up, has some liquidity in the bank, has saved a little bit of money. So he's
perfect situation.
That's right. Everything matched up. But the key here is the practice was priced extremely high because the overhead was low, free cash flow was over $600,000 a year out of this practice.
Wow.
From a doc working 3 days a week doing bread and butter.
Okay.
So the younger doc looks at that and says, wow, this purchase price, the tag's a little steep. It's $900,000 for this practice. But remember, what he's buying is a job that's now going to pay him $600,000 a year minus his debts and minus the financing.
Right. If you can $600,000 a year and you've got a $900,000 loan, it seems like things are going to be all right.
That's right. And I'd focus more on the net take home of the practice as opposed to the loan amount that you're taking out. Okay. So in his circumstance, I think the loan was around $110,000 a year. That was the payment. So 600 minus 110, he should be making about $490 a year before you adjust for other factors. So he's borrowing $900,000 for the ability to make $490 a year.
I think I'd do that deal every day. That's
right.
Kind of a no-brainer.
And he did. And
I am no occlusion guru. Let's just say that at one point in dental school, I decided I wanted to do single tooth dentistry from that point on. And as we know, people can get pretty passionate and dogmatic about their approach to occlusion. That was one of the things that really surprised me about Spear Education is that they aren't telling people that they need to do the same thing every time. In fact, it's the opposite. You should adapt your approach to occlusion to each individual patient. Here's Dr. Frank Spear in the Occlusal Concepts and Philosophies course.
How does my head get around the fact that there's all these different philosophies that people talk about how we should be treating occlusion? If I just use the patient's existing occlusion, am I going to be okay? Am I going to be successful? Certainly this patient has evidence that they're doing a lot of damage to their posterior teeth. What's quite interesting is if you look at the patient's anterior teeth, you'll notice there's not a lot of tooth wear. And the only possible answer, if the posterior teeth are being destroyed through attrition, is this patient has to have an anterior open bite. He has to be able to grind his teeth and not touch the anteriors. Well, if you ask him to bite, he in fact doesn't have an open bite. His anterior teeth touch. But if you actually were to seat his condyles and see what his occlusion looks like when his condyles are seated, he actually has no anterior contact whatsoever, and he quite clearly matches up with the posterior wear facets very well. And so what we want to do throughout this entire occlusion topic is talk about when is it predictable and safe to use what's there? When would you be better off changing it? In a patient like this, my opinion, you'd be better off changing it.
If you want access to this course and many others, whether you're doing small cases or big ones, these are fundamentals that you should know. Go to speareducation.com and request a guest pass. No-brainer.
And he did, and I've checked in with him every single month subsequently, and he's doing great. That's awesome. The mindset. Listen, no matter how smart you are, how headstrong you are, you're still going to think twice, and you're going to swallow that Adam's apple when you're getting ready to sign a loan for another $900,000 or whatever the amount may be, on top of all the other debts that you've just incurred. But it's not consumer debt. You're not just adding to your debt load. You're actually buying a job and buying cash flow.
Okay, perfect. And that's like the exact perspective that is hard to wrap your mind around. But once you fully embrace it, it's still going to be hard, like you said, but that's just the direction you have to go. to dig yourself out of your student loan debt and give yourself a good opportunity for producing. I mean, this is your cash flow for the rest of your career that you're buying here.
That's right.
So I like baby steps, as we've already discussed. I'm ex Dave Ramsey guy. So let's break this down. So you said contact a lender first. So I thought that was interesting. So maybe reach out to one of the national dental lenders, because they're used to evaluating dentists and saying, okay, we like the dentist and we do or don't like the practice, let's lend. So you would maybe reach out to one of them and say, I'm interested in finding a practice. Here's my situation financially. Do you think I would be able to get a loan, assuming I find a good practice? So is that what you would do first?
Yes. And if there's certain areas or criteria where you're deficient, I've had one guy where he was religiously paying down extra principal on his student loan.
Right.
So he's 3 years out of school. He's a great producer at a corporate job. And he says, Matt, my student loan balance is under 6 figures. I said, that's great. We go to the bank. The bank says, well, you're buying a practice that's priced at about $1 million. We need you to have anywhere from 5 to 10% liquidity in the bank. Not that you're putting the money in the deal. We just need to know that you have 50 to 100,000 sitting under your mattress that's
a buffer
in non-retirement accounts, right? He's like, well, I would have, except I paid down my loans. So my personal balance sheet looks great. I don't have a lot of debt. I don't have a lot of student loans.
Right.
Aren't I a great borrower? And the bank says no. The bank would rather see you set aside that cash to buffer the first couple months and year of practice ownership and make sure that you can cover those debts than overpay on your student loan.
Okay. And that's,
once again, that flies in the face of Dave Ramsey, but I don't think Dave's ever been a dentist.
no. And this is the perspective that people don't have unless they've done this before and tried to get lending. And so you can think that you're doing the right thing for years with your head down, trying to save and pay things down. And then you look up and you realize I've been going in the wrong direction the whole time. So that's perfect. That's what we're trying to avoid. Okay. So step 1, contact a lender with your personal financials, figure out if you're in the ballpark. Okay. So now step 2,
call the brokers in town.
Okay. So, and someone, I can't remember who was talking about this. Maybe it was even Reese, where he was talking about you need someone who has access to the deals, the available practices. And that's your local brokers. They're going to have knowledge of the market. They're going to have contacts. They're going to have deals that are coming in and upcoming. So reaching out to all the brokers is going to put you on their radar. And now you've actually kind of got people who are trying to help you out by finding a practice for you.
That's right. And they will love you if you say, hey, I already talked to Bank of America Practice Solutions or Wells Fargo's Practice Finance Department, and they've given me, generally speaking, a green light. They'll love you because there are, right now, it's very disproportionate in terms of buyers. There's a lot of buyers running around kicking tires, and most of the brokers are trying to be efficient with their time, and they want to know that the people they're going to invest time with showing practices to are financially pre-qualified, or at least going to be able to consummate the transaction if we get to that point. Okay.
So that's going to save everyone some time. It's going to get their attention a little bit more too. So maybe they're going to know that you're serious and that something might actually happen with you as opposed to maybe other people. So stepping back a second, how would you decide where to practice? If you're looking at demographics and opportunities and rural versus metro, and you're in a large metro area, but it has a diverse, from downtown Phoenix and Mesa and Tempe to the outskirts of Maricopa County. Do you have any, not biases, but just pointers that you would give to someone looking to buy that first practice for themselves on kind of that overall location?
Yeah. Here's what I see. The very metro areas are extremely competitive.
Okay.
Number 1, a decent practice goes lightning quick. Number 2, the ability to grow a practice organically is much harder. And number 3, because of the pressures of overhead and wage competition, your take home is going to be a little bit less.
Right.
That's a trade-off. If you look at the rural practices, speaking for Arizona, Richard, you know the rural market. There's a lot of secondary and tertiary markets.
Sure.
Flagstaff, Sedona. We sold one in Kingman a couple months ago that's closer to Vegas than Phoenix, frankly.
Right.
Tucson, Globe. Those practices, man, they're cash cows. I look at these practice listings that I get in these secondary markets, and if I could pick it up, move it, and drop it into Phoenix, I'd be able to sell it for 30% more, and I'd have 3 full price offers the first day.
Huh.
There's just that much difference in competition. You look at these practices in the rural settings, and for the most part, they're good quality practices. They're bread and butter dentists that are selling, and the overhead's much lower and the cash flow's much better.
Well, and these secondary markets that you're listing, these aren't like the smallest podunk town in Arizona. These are still bigger areas that, you know, populations of up to 100,000, but not Phoenix.
Yeah. And the reason why I see that is because a lot of the younger generation of dental school graduates are flocking to the metro areas, at least here in Arizona. And I think, without getting philosophical, it's because a lot of them are dual professionals now. They have a spouse that's either married and a professional.
Sure.
And gosh, if I'm a computer engineer and my spouse is a dentist, and my spouse buys a practice in Globe, Arizona, the prospects of me getting a job as a computer engineer in Globe are slim to none. But if we're in a metro area, all of a sudden the availability of spousal jobs is much higher. So from that perspective, and just from wanting to have a different work-life balance and activities, events, interests outside of work, most of the buyers are moving and even willing to take a pay cut or a reduction in income to live in a more populated area. And
Howard Fran has some pretty strong opinions about telling people to, rather than go live on a boat for the Navy for 6 months, go live in some rural area and open a practice there. But I also see the lifestyle side of things, and if that's where you want to be, then you just have to understand that and then make it work.
Right. So getting back, kind of tying this back in, that's one of the first things I do. I listened to one of your podcasts with Jason Wood, and without recapping everything he said, one of the important things that he talked about in the beginning is know yourself.
Right.
And you need to know that before you start looking at practices. Know what locations you and or your family are comfortable going to, where you're not comfortable going to. And then also knowing yourself clinically, what kind of procedures you do, financially, what kind of net you need to have. Those are kind of the key things to help you narrow down your search criteria even before you start pouring through the multitude of listings that are out there.
Okay, great. That's an awesome.
And you can do that on your own. You don't need an advisor to do that. That's more fundamental decisions that you can make on your own.
And might be frustrating if you contact advisors and you're like, well, I don't even know where I want to practice. And they're like, well, I can't help you then. So
Richard, I get that a lot, honestly. I pick up the phone no matter who calls me, and I'll always talk with someone and give them what advice I can. But I get a lot of calls from people that say, I just know I'm sick of my current job and I want out.
Right.
That I can't help you with that. You need to narrow down your criteria on your own a little bit. Location, clinical, financial, all those things need to be narrowed down yourself, and then knowing what you can qualify for financially, and then reach out to the brokers. And at that point, you can articulate to them clearly and concisely, hey, here's my search parameters.
Right.
For example, I have 25 offices available right now in Arizona.
Oh, wow.
And if someone calls me and they say, hey, I'm looking for a practice, I don't even know where we start. So first questions I ask are, have you thought about location? Have you thought about what kind of clinical things you do? What are you proficient in? Do you do molar endo? Do you place implants? A lot of these general practices these days, the dentist will do one or multiple
specialty
different procedures, whether it's specialty, whether they're doing ortho. And you got to make sure you match up with that. What kind of insurance type you take. If you've been working for the first 3 years of your career in an office that takes Medicaid, you're going to be hard pressed to buy and transition successfully into a fee-for-service cosmetic practice.
Sure.
Even if you can do the procedures, just the pace, the volume, the
case presentation.
Yeah, completely different. So know those. That way you can narrow down your search criteria much better when you reach out to the brokers and those influencers in the market that have practices available. That'll help you know where you need to start, and you can articulate that to them, and then they'll help kind of customize and say, okay, then here's the 3 practices that fit your criteria, and then they'll send you a package.
Okay.
That's the time where you need to start enlisting the help of those other key members of your team.
Okay, cool. So let me go back and summarize this, and this is awesome because now we have a step before that. So we basically figure out what we want out of life, what we need financially, what we can handle production-wise, procedure-wise, practice vision, practice style. Figure that out, narrow that down, come up with a plan, go to a lender, talk with them. Now we start looking at practices with brokers. The one thing before I want to go into looking at these actual practices, I want to go into this idea of off-market practices. So and it's funny that I'm asking you because this is like circumventing you. And so I wanted to hear your opinions on this. There are some practices where the dentist maybe is willing to sell, but they haven't reached out to a broker because they're old and crotchety and they don't want to pay a broker. And so in their mind, they're like kind of ready to retire, but they haven't actually listed it yet. Is this idea of these off-market practices and being able to either reach out to them directly via letters or, networking or visiting practices or calling practices, is that a thing that works for people, or is that like a pipe dream, or where does that work and where does it not work?
It's great. I think it's a great strategy. I don't care if it's circumventing me, because the reality is there's enough business that I stay busy. And if a dentist can find a good diamond in the rough on their own, more power to them.
Sure.
The one thing I'll tell you is you need to have a lot of time and energy to do that, to go and bird dog opportunities outside of your normal, whatever it is, 8 to 5, 7 to 5
practice.
job cutting teeth.
Yeah.
And right. I don't know. I've never been a dentist. I've never practiced a day in my life, but I've got to imagine, based on all my interaction, that a full day of doing dentistry is pretty demanding emotionally, physically, and mentally.
Right.
And when you do that on a repeated basis, then where do you find the time to bird dog all of these potential opportunities? And you're going to have to, as the saying goes, kiss a lot of frogs before you find a prince. You're going to have to dig through a lot of letters, a lot of initial meetings where the seller just maybe passively entertaining it or things of that nature. So you're going to have to go through, you're just going to have to really know that it's a time investment on your end. Well, but the outcome can potentially be great.
The thing that comes to mind, actually, as I'm thinking, as you talk about all of the work that would be required to do this, because this is something I'm willing and interested in doing as I transition out of the Army eventually. But it's hard enough right now. I have people that send me practice information from brokers that have sent them practice information. They're trying to think through the information and sort through it all. And then I take a look at it for them. I'm like, well, their husband is the practice manager and they're not paid. And this dentist is only taking home 20% of the overall revenue anyways. So if you then have to hire a practice manager and you only had 20, so I'm doing my best to help them and digest this information. But if you don't have all that information, if you're having to find the practice and then get the information from that dentist, oh, can I see all your P&Ls? And, a lot of times the brokers will have these really nice questionnaires that the dentist has filled out that give you a ton of information about their practice. That's kissing even more frogs. It's like you have to find people who are willing to talk to you. And then you kind of have to do all that vetting yourself of the financials and practice opportunity without the data so that you can quickly look at it, make a decision, decide if it's worth your time to move on. So,
yeah. And here's 2 other thoughts. If you're soliciting someone who may just casually be entertaining an offer, how do you know that they're a real seller? I've seen experiences where you go through that process, you find an unlisted practice, You meet with the seller. You guys hit it off. You spend 3 months gathering the financial information. Then you get a loan that takes a month or two for the underwriting. And then you kind of negotiate a contract. And all of a sudden, the selling dentist says, I'm just not ready to hang it up yet. This has been an exhausting process. Richard, that happens. And if they haven't made a commitment to officially list their practice either on their own or with a broker, you don't know that they're fully committed. You can spend time, energy, and money with consultants only to get to the finish line and have the rug pulled out from under you. So you're taking a little bit more risk on an unlisted practice. And then the other thing I'll tell you is the role of a good broker, among other things, is to preserve the goodwill in the transition.
Okay.
I don't know where I heard this phrase. I'm the sin eater in a lot of these transactions because what I want to do
ultimately. The sin eater? Is that what you said?
Yep.
Okay.
I think I just made that up. I might have coined that on my own.
Yeah, that's a weird term. I like it. Okay.
But basically all of the back and forth interaction that can kind of wear down a relationship, I buffer that. And I take a lot of punches from both sides when there's frustration or when there's concerns, when there's a difference that we're trying to reconcile in perspective. And a good broker is able to absorb a lot of that while still preserving the goodwill of both parties. I had a good experience recently with a practice here in Scottsdale that was a big practice. It's over 50 years old in place.
Holy cow. Wow.
It was doing over $2 million a year in collections, just a 2-doc general office. So we had a young dentist buying the practice, and this young dentist is smart. Graduated from a top dental school at the top of his class, got an MBA.
Wow.
It's been out for a couple of years and has just been a killer in producing at his corporate job. So this was a really good fit for him. Clinically, personality, location, everything fit. And we're negotiating towards the end, and there was the question of it was accrued employee benefits. I mean, that's down in the weeds, right?
Right.
We're at the goal line. We're at the 1-yard line, and there's accrued benefits. And this new buyer is going to have to take over.
And what is that
for
this audience? What does that even mean? What is accrued employee benefits? Because I think a lot of people don't even know that's a thing.
Got it. I might have just made that up too. But accrued employee benefits, if you have salaried employees, you're usually going to give them paid time off or vacation days, sick days.
Yeah.
And you pay them along the way. So they're not hourly. So they get the same paycheck on a week where you have Christmas and you have 2 days off as they do in June where there's no days off. So they're paid days off. And if they call in sick on a certain day, they don't get paid less. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So there, you've got salaried employees and they've built up some paid time off that maybe they haven't used. That's
right. And in a practice where this is a fantastic practice, a lot of the staff has been there 10, 20 years. You can imagine that there's a fair amount of unused vacation and sick days that have built up.
Yeah.
Yes. And so that was not an insignificant dollar amount. And we reached an impasse. The seller said, you know what? I'm done with it. I'm just exhausted. I'm at the point where I'm just ready to, I'll walk away. I'm not going to give a credit of $12,000 for all of the built up and accrued sick time and vacation time.
What was the overall value? What was the purchase price?
1.65.
Okay. So 12 grand. Yeah. It might seem like a lot, but in the, it was less than 1%.
Yes. Yep. It was completely irrational, but you get to that point when you're that far along in a transition negotiation on something with the stakes that high. And remember, everyone going through a transition usually has external factors going on.
Sure.
Sometimes it's divorce that precipitates it. It's the thought of retirement. It's hanging up the drill clinically. There's just so many other factors that you realize that a lot of times the issue isn't the real issue.
Mm.
And that was the deal in this case. So I took that to the buyer and I said, listen, I know you're frustrated. You felt like you've paid him his fair due. You're paying him full ask price. You didn't nickel and dime on the price. You've been agreeable on just about every term. And it's time for you to get a win. I get it. But I don't understand why. It's illogical. but this person's digging in their heels, and this is a deal breaker for them. So I'm able to present it in a much different approach than the seller would, because the seller
than the email conversation that would occur between them if they were communicating directly.
That's right. That's right. The seller said, listen, I don't care. You tell them take it or leave it. I'm done. I'm exhausted. So of course that's not the way I present it. And the buyer's nervous, understandably, taking on a 1.6, 1.7 loan in addition to student loans, in addition to a mortgage. And so I had that conversation with the buyer, and the buyer said, I get it. I understand. I'll make this one last concession because I want to. And we talked about the importance of preserving the goodwill. I said, 1.2, 1.3 of what you're buying is goodwill. And you know what? You're going to save 12 grand if you fight on this, maybe. But all that 1.2 million of goodwill just became bad will. And the value just evaporated.
Right.
Because that seller isn't going to sing your praises to the staff, talk you up to the patient base. There's another provider, dentist, that have been there 20 years that's going to continue to stay on board. That dentist is going to talk to the other dentist and tell them, hey, your boss is a real jerk. Or, hey, the new guy's, pretty decent. Give him a fair shake. So we talked about that, and the buyer said, okay, I get it. I can see the forest and through the trees. I get the big picture. I'm on board. So I said, great. I want you to call the seller and convey this message now, because I want you to get the win and to get the emotional credit for doing that. And I'm telling you, Richard, that was a complete inflection point in the deal, where from then on, the deal went smooth. There was just the lubrication of goodwill. And fast forward 9 months later, the seller realized he wanted to stay in the office and he wasn't ready to stop practicing entirely.
Sure.
And the buyer said, great, I'd love to have you around as a mentor. And it's worked out even better than we could have imagined the transition work out.
That's awesome.
So I share that story to illustrate the importance of a lot of times having a broker, or at least a CPA or an intermediary or a good attorney that can help facilitate the tough conversations. And when you're communicating on your own with an off-market practice, you have to have those difficult conversations yourself directly.
Right. And maybe you get lucky and you have someone that it all works out with, but there's a chance that maybe you and him don't see eye to eye on every single point. And if you don't have the perspective and the buffer of someone who's helping this work, who's seen it done before and can step back and not get so zoomed in, I can see how that would easily implode. There's one thing from that story that I want to kind of talk about for a second, because I think our audience, like I said, might not understand this. So goodwill, you talked about that being like a specific dollar value of the purchase. What does that mean, like financially, tax wise? Because you kind of talked about what it meant emotionally. You're preserving the goodwill, meaning that this practice, he's going to recommend you to the future patients or in the transition. He's going to work with you. He's going to endorse you. Emotionally, that makes sense. The transition going well. But what does that mean financially, goodwill?
Okay. I'll give you an analogy. There was a fad or a craze a couple years ago of these reality TV shows like Storage Wars, where people were going in and buying stuff.
When was I watching Storage Wars? I like binge watched one of those. I think, it was when I was selling Vivint between undergrad and dental school.
Okay, so good. That's your frame of reference. Imagine if I took that practice with this 50 years of history in the community and I auctioned it off Storage Wars style. Do you remember the fast talking guy that's like doing the auction?
Yeah.
Their little paddles. So imagine I did that with the practice.
You just got it.
What is there to sell? There's the equipment. Yeah, they got a couple-year-old CBCT. They have a CEREC. I think it was a blue cam, not an Omni cam. They've got 12 chairs. 10 of them are 30 years old. They've got a couple digital sensors. They got an intraoral camera. They had a nice, floor rolling Zeiss microscope. And they got about 10 computers. What's the value of that, Richard, if I auctioned it off?
Like auction price, maybe a couple $100,000, maybe.
Yeah. About 250 to 300,000 total, all in. And what else? You've got supplies. In practice doing $2 million, The cupboards are pretty full with goo and gauze and gloves and impression material.
Okay.
That's maybe another 20 or 30 grand.
Sure.
You've got nice furniture chairs. You've got a waiting room. You've got chairs, end tables. You got a break room with a fridge, a microwave. It's another $25,000.
Okay.
All right. So add that up. How much do we have? We'll say the equipment was 300. The supplies were 25 and the office furniture is 25. So for round numbers, we're at $350,000.
Okay.
That's it. That's all the practice is worth if we auctioned it off.
Okay. So
why is someone paying 1.6 for it?
Because the patients associated with that practice are worth that difference.
That's exactly right. And that's the goodwill. The goodwill is the relationships with existing patients who have habitually come to the office for their recall and recare programs. They know where they come when they need dentistry. You have an ongoing business that produces revenue and cash flow by virtue of the patient relationships with the office and the provider.
So is part of what you do when you are selling this, like someone has to put a dollar value to that goodwill, it sounds like.
Yes.
Where does that come from?
Algebra.
Okay.
You remember algebra?
Vaguely.
Okay, I do, unfortunately. I'm a numbers guy. I never could have made it through dental school, but I like numbers. Numbers always seem to be consistent to me, and they always tell a story. So algebra is when you're solving for a variable. You've got a little equation, and you've got to solve for X. So in the appraisal process, the goodwill is X. We kind of went through that exercise. You start with the end valuation. I look and I base my valuation on a million different things, both qualitative and quantitative.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, oversimplifying it, you're buying a job and you're buying cash flow. So after all the other little things are factored in, it's mostly about a job and cash flow. And so based on the revenue and the net income that practice provides, my value was 1.6.
Okay.
And that's validated by the fact that we could find multiple lenders that would finance it at that amount, and that I could bring multiple qualified offers to the table at that amount. Because at the end of the day, this is an important point to make. The true arbiter of value isn't in appraisal, it's the free market. And that's maybe too textbook, but what I'm saying is if you can find a buyer, a qualified buyer that can obtain financing at that amount, that's what the value of a practice is, not necessarily what an appraisal says.
And that's why practices in downtown Phoenix that are doing the exact same numbers sell for more than the Kingman practice.
That's right. That's tying it right back home. So I do the appraisal based on revenue and income and cash flow, among other subjective things, and I come up with 1.6. Then I go through the subtraction process to solve for X being the goodwill in this equation. So you look and you say, okay, I know the equipment's worth 300. I know the furniture and fixtures are worth 25, and I know the supplies on hand are worth 25. So 1.6 minus 300 in equipment and 350, solve. There's our goodwill value.
Right.
Now, here's why goodwill is important to know that and why we have to go through that exercise. Number one, it's great in terms of illustrative purpose for you to really look at it and see, oh my gosh, I'm paying 1.2 just for the ability to take over this office. So I bet it's imperative that I make sure that I treat people right, I treat people fairly, I do everything I can to preserve the way this office has been running. Hopefully it's been running well and it's been producing that income and revenue. So I got to preserve that. That goodwill is intangible. But secondly, from a tax perspective, each one of those categories are taxed differently as a buyer.
Okay.
Your equipment, you can take a write-off on your taxes. It's called depreciation. It's a non-cash expense. You can take that write-off very quickly over the next, sometimes 1 year, sometimes 7 years on your taxes. Full disclosure, I'm a big fan of consultants staying in their lane. I'm not a CPA. I'm not a tax advisor. So I want to make that clear.
Okay.
But you'll depreciate the equipment and a lot of those tangible things over a 1 to 7 year period.
So and that effectively lowers how much taxes you have to pay over the first 5 to 7 years of your practice.
Yes. Yep.
So you can take more home, you can pay down loans, you can use that dollar amount helps you, and that depreciation helps you as a new owner.
Yes. And now the goodwill portion, you depreciate over a much longer period. There will be a CPA listening to me and they'll say, you don't depreciate it, you amortize it. It's semantics. Same thing. One's tangible, one's intangible. But basically, you're writing down, you're expensing that goodwill over 15 years now, a much longer period. So the tax break comes
gradually,
much slower in smaller increments. Important thing to remember, if you're a buyer, you want to allocate as much as you can to equipment and as little to goodwill because you can write it off quicker.
Okay.
But keep in mind, at the end of the day, whether it's quick or slow, ultimately the tax deduction amount will be the same.
Okay.
Right? Whether you're taking it over 15 years or 7 years, you get the tax deduction at the end of the day.
Right.
At the end of 15 years, I should say, not at the end of the day.
Right.
Now, just something to be aware of. It's so important in these transitions to know the other side's motives and the other person's perspective. That really helps when you can be empathetic in the process. So know that it's different for the seller. For them, all that amount that's allocated towards goodwill, say it's 1.2 in the example that we've been using, they pay a flat tax rate. Depending on your tax bracket, it's either 15 or 20%.
Okay.
But equipment, supplies, furniture, you're taxed at an ordinary income rate, which can be anywhere from 30 to 40%.
So is the goodwill like a capital gains tax?
Yes. Yeah, it's taxed at the same rate as a long-term capital gains tax.
Okay.
So don't overthink this. The long and the short of it is, as a buyer, you get the same tax write-off ultimately, but it's much slower over the years. But from a seller's perspective, depending on how much you put in goodwill or equipment, they'll pay a bigger or a smaller tax on the year that practice is sold.
So it's to their advantage to have more in goodwill as a seller.
Yes. And remember, that changes their overall tax burden. What they've got to pay in taxes. So when you get in the debate and the arm wrestling over goodwill and equipment, buyers on one side, sellers on the other, just remember it means a lot more to the seller than it does to the buyer.
Because it does actually change the amount they pay, where it doesn't change the amount of depreciation you get. It just extends it.
Yes. And having a good advisor, either a CPA or an attorney that has a good tax acumen or a broker, is important to be able to pull you aside and have that conversation with you and explain it so that you as a buyer can make that concession, because that's going to be a negotiating point. And understanding that the interests of the seller are much higher stakes than yours, that's an area where you can give a little bit without losing, and you gain a lot of ground with the seller.
Okay. And if you understand why that's important to them, then it's a strategic thing that you're doing on purpose, rather than you're feeling like you're getting screwed because they're putting more as goodwill.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. That was awesome. So, I don't think I've had goodwill broken down for me like that before. And I didn't understand both the dual dynamic and the tax implications and the negotiating part of that. I don't even know if I'm sure there's a podcast that someone's done somewhere, but I'm excited because I think I don't know if this has been laid out so well anywhere else.
Thanks. Just remember, it all comes back to storage wars.
Right. Exactly. So let's talk about one more thing, and then I kind of want to cut things off at an hour, and I think we've got another hour's worth of content of valuation and other negotiation things and real estate and leases. One thing I want to talk about is avoiding lemons. So avoiding the truly bad practices. And what do you do as a broker if someone comes to you and you're just like, oh, this is not good. Like, you do not have a good practice. Like, but they still want to sell it. You still have to represent, like, how does that work? And what do those lemons look like? What does the practice that you don't want to buy look like?
That's a good question.
And this could be bad because you might have some of these listed right now.
I do. You can't have all gravy listings. And what I do, and this is just me personally, I've found that I'm most comfortable having a difficult conversation with the owner of that practice right at the onset.
Okay.
Say, listen, I've done my initial information gathering, fact finding, due diligence, and as I've started down the road of appraisal, here's the big red flags and here's the issues. I have one practice right now where every month for the last 4 years, as far back as we've gone, every month they collect 6 figures, over $100,000 every single month.
Wow.
For 4 years straight. So 48 months, just boom, 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 boom. And then we're getting ready to sell. Their last 3 months in order have been 80, 90, 70.
Okay.
Is that a problem?
It's not a good trend.
It's a problem if I were the buyer.
Yeah.
It really is. So I've got to sit down and have a difficult conversation about what is going on. Buyers don't want to catch a falling knife, and it's indicative of instability. And remember, a lot of what you're buying in Goodwill isn't last month's production, but it's consistent trends over time that really shows how many continuously active patients you have. Not turning and burning patients, but active, reoccurring patients.
Okay.
So you asked about what do I do when I come across those? I have the difficult conversation. I sit them down and say, listen, these are fundamental problems. There's still value in your practice, but we need to know what's contributing to these factors, and then we need to price it in there. And I hate it. You hate it. It's painful, but that's just the reality. And I do that because I want to set a realistic sales price off the bat.
So then when people are looking at buying it, it's not like I'm overpaying for crap. It's like, well, no, I've got a lower price because it's not as good.
And most of the time, if you've got good advisors involved, the crap's going to come to the surface before the closing. It's inevitable.
Right.
So here's what happens. You find the crap after you've invested a ton of time and energy, and both parties have spent money on consultants. And then you start negotiating and you start lowballing. Hey, if the practice was listed for 500, it's really worth 350 with all these mitigating factors. Well, then the offer starts coming in at 325, 340. And you know what happens to that goodwill?
Disappears.
Poof, it's gone. It's gone. And then both parties are going to lose. So I try and head that off at the beginning. I don't know if every broker operates that way, but that's both selfishly and in terms of preserving deals and reputation. You want to identify those up front. Now, you asked a question about what are the indicators of a lemon, if you will.
Yeah.
Here's my mantra. A good practice at a high price is still a good deal. Don't be afraid to overpay for a great practice. But conversely, a bad practice at a great price is still a bad deal. I was talking to a guy today that's looking at buying a practice in Tucson for 37% of last year's collections. Huh. And side note, we'll talk about this in a future podcast. I hate the percentage of collections metric.
Yeah.
But if I have 5 seconds and somebody holds a gun to my head and says, what's the practice worth? I'll default to that methodology.
Okay.
So
what are the ranges? What's Phoenix Metro versus outlying Phoenix versus, a rural Kingston?
Out of those, take a cross section. Those 30 deals last year, anywhere from 40% to 115%.
Okay, so it's a big range.
That's why you don't want to oversimplify it.
Okay.
So all that being said, the doc calls me today and says 37% of collections, it's a steal. Well, you know what we start to find out? Collections are declining. It's a Medicaid practice. They've had 3 providers in the last year. A lot of the collections were implants that the general is doing. And guess what? The buyer doesn't place implants. I'm telling you, I don't care what the price is, you're going to inherit a mess that you're not suited to operate. And you know what I see a lot when that transition happens? That doctor's not making any money. He's working there for free. He's barely paying bills when the opportunity cost, he could still be working at a good corporate job making 120 to 200 a year.
Right.
And instead he's making nothing.
And dying inside every single night.
Yes. Yeah. Going back to the point of this isn't consumer debt. It's not like a house where you can buy a house and realize, ooh, I didn't really research the neighborhood. The train is loud at night, or it's in a flight pattern, or something happened down the street and there's it's a less desirable community.
I'm sick of driving from Vistancia down to Glendale.
Right. You could set, Richard, you could have sold your home relatively easily and taken a small loss and sold it quickly.
Sure.
There's a lot of buyers and sellers. You buy a terrible practice, not only are you losing that income that you could be making somewhere else, but it's not easy to turn around and sell a practice to someone else. So you're stuck with that anchor.
So it's an extremely illiquid asset, and your income is tied to that asset. So your like risk is almost doubled there if you buy something really bad.
Yep, it is. And remember, it was a good price. Hey, got it for cheap. Doesn't really matter. The price is so much less important than the quality and the fit of what you're looking for.
Okay.
So the lemons that I'd look for, I'd look at the location. I would look at what kind of treatments are being done. I'd look at their recall system to see how strong the hygiene department is. I'd look at the staff tenure, and I'd look at the insurances that they accept, what plans they're most prominent or what plans they're credentialed on. Those are all of the qualitative things that I'd look at that are real deal breakers to me.
Okay. And I think we're gonna have to dive into this. So because we're at like an hour mark right now. So I want to next episode, if you're still willing, we dive into how you digest a practice, valuation wise, the different ways to value a practice, and then how these other factors play, the qualitative factors, real estate, all of those things play into the overall picture in the next episode. This has been awesome. Like I personally, this is why I love this podcast, is because I'm learning a ton. And if no one else listens, this was a blast. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing these stories and sharing your expertise, and for your many, many, many hours. I feel like I didn't see you when you started this bid. For like that first year. You have put in so many hours, and now we all get to benefit from your experience and all the things that you've seen. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Matt Porter, we are going to get you back, and we're going to have another awesome episode on this acquisition process. We'll talk to you next time.
Perfect. Thanks for having me, Richard.
No problem. Bye. Okay. I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. Matt Porter is an awesome guy. If you're in the Phoenix Valley, you're looking at doing a transition, definitely reach out to him at menlotransitions.com. You can reach Matt at 480-290-7720 or matt@menlotransitions.com. And that'll all be in the show notes. Look for another episode, a bonus episode that's paying tribute to Blue Sky Bio for sponsoring the first 4 episodes of season 2. And you'll get to hear some more from Dr. Corey Glenn. Also, we're still looking for people with practice financials that we can look at and evaluate on the podcast. So look in the show notes for Hunter Smith, Dr. Hunter Smith's email, or you can just email me, richard@sharedpractices.com.